Thank you very much, Jonathan. Okay, let's begin. The Industrial Revolution marks a turning point in world history, starting in Britain in the late 18th century and spreading rapidly to other Anglophone nations in a handful of Britain European neighbours in the early 19th century. Industrialisation marked the demise of traditional agrarian economy and the way of life that had accompanied it. It pushed up incomes, it raised living standards, it changed patterns of work, housing, family life, transportation and culture. Industrial revolutions ushered in new lifestyles wherever they've occurred and established the global divergence between parts of the West and most of the rest of the world that we still live with today. It is little surprise that its causes and consequences have intrigued scholars for many generations. Throughout most of the 20th century, the Industrial Revolution was really a topic for British historians. Scholarship was premised on the idea of British or perhaps European exceptionalism, and the search was on for those features of modern Britain or early modern Britain or maybe perhaps 18th century Europe, its science, its technology, its institutions, political, financial, legal, its social, cultural, religious beliefs, whatever it was that set it apart from other parts of the world. In around the 1990s, however, global historians began to argue that a wider perspective was necessary. And there are a great many scholars and disciplines that we can look to in order to sketch this history. It's obviously a huge literature and more than one can ever summarise in the course of a lecture. But I thought it would be interesting to start with the work of the sociologist Janet Abu-Lughod. There we go. She pointed out that in the medieval and early modern period, the centre of the world economy had lain over in the East, not in Europe, and most certainly not in Britain. The dominance of the East derived from their sophisticated manufacturing industries, particularly in textiles in West Indies and China. So over here, the west of India, sorry, not the West Indies, the west of India and China. Amongst historians, Ken Pomerantz arguably offered the most influential contribution to this debate by looking at China. He argued that parts of China were as wealthy as Britain in the middle of the 18th century and that they might have embarked on a pathway to industrialisation if, and it is a big if, but if China had possessed some of the advantages enjoyed by Little Britain over there. American colonies, which provided it with raw materials, especially cotton, and its rich and accessible coal deposits. Pomerantz also coined the term the Great Divergence to describe the gulf that opened up between industrialising and non-industrialising nations from the 18th century onwards. But if Pomerantz was influential, he certainly wasn't alone. And in fact, I would say that his arguments gained much of the traction they did because at the time there were a great many other scholars, as I say, both in history and outside history, looking both at China and other parts of the globe and saying, developing a fairly similar set of arguments. It provided in all a very useful corrective to the Eurocentrism of traditional accounts. And these scholars drew attention to pockets of advanced development outside Europe and challenged the claim that it was some form of long-standing superiority in Europe that made the divergence inevitable. However, in the lively debate triggered by this provocation, scholars did begin to question the claims of similarity between China and India on the one hand and Europe on the other. Critics argued not only that if you look at per capita wealth, wealth levels per capita are much lower in China and India, so far as we can tell on the basis of very sketchy data, certainly lower than they were in Britain, lower than they were in many parts of Europe. They also pointed to really profound differences in the social, cultural and political spheres in these different parts of the globe. But there was one element of Pomerantz's argument and others of the time that was not so easily put to one side. And this concerned the assertion that Britain's colonies and its exploitation of resources beyond its own borders served as the seed corn for its own process of industrialisation. Indeed, these claims have arguably gained rather than declined in significance, particularly with what has been called the new history of capitalism. So the new history of capitalism is a very large literature concerned primarily with the origin and place of capitalism in the modern world, and it goes beyond the parameters of the debate about the Great Divergence that was established in the 2000s. But at its heart, it does share a similar problematic. It asks, why did some nations grow rich in the 19th century whilst others stagnated, maybe even declined? Sven Beckert's hugely influential Empire of Cotton argued for a constellation of forces which he termed war capitalism, Coercion, violence, empires, exploitation, guns, slavery, all being baked into the making of the modern world. It clearly makes for a much darker account of the transition to modernity than that which we happily accepted for many years. But my first observation of the evening isn't about light and shade as such. It's a much simpler one, about place and difference. When historians first turned to global history in order to understand the roots of the British Industrial Revolution, they looked primarily at China and at India. By contrast, the new history of capitalism looks largely here, at North America. In fact, almost all of the work that we could consider the new history of capitalism is produced by US-based scholars looking at US history, though this geographical specialism is really obscured when works are titled around themes of global capitalism rather than presented as what I think they probably should be presented as, a chapter in US history. Furthermore, in turning to the United States and Canada, we could almost make a reverse argument about relevance. So experts of China and India have argued that China and India are actually very different from Europe in some key respects. But when we look at the US and contrast it with Europe in the 18th century, one of the things I'm struck by is not difference, but rather the similarity. After all, there are obviously very strong linguistic, cultural, economic, social and political similarities between Britain and the US. Indeed, the two nations were tied together in a colonial relationship right down to the late 18th century, until, obviously, American independence was recognised. And culturally, they've remained very close thereafter, arguably right up, in fact, to the present day. So I have no dispute with the global frame, but I do ask, have we been looking in the right parts of the globe? Is the new history of capitalism really doing global history at all? Tonight I want to argue that Europe is a much more obvious and illuminating point of comparison than China, India or the United States. Britain's nearest neighbour was France, and France was a large, rich, wealthy trading nation. It had a population that was more than double that of Britain, maybe as high as 28 million in 1700 compared to Britain's 8 or 9 million. And this at a time when population is very closely correlated with wealth and strength. It is Europe's largest and richest country. It had a very large agricultural sector, advanced food processing, one thinks of its wine, plus of course manufacture, textiles, paper, iron, ceramics and so forth. In the middle of the 18th century, France had the largest economy in Europe. It had larger volumes of foreign trade and higher manufacturing output. If you knew that the Industrial Revolution was coming and you wanted to place your bets, I think you would probably have put your money not on Britain but on France. And of course, no less significantly, and unlike China and India, France was in fact within the first wave of nations in continental Europe to industrialise, doing so along with Belgium and Switzerland around 50 years later than Britain. I don't have a lot of time tonight to talk about the Swiss experience, but I do also just want to point out that Switzerland, like Belgium, is starting to industrialise very early, by the turn of the 19th century. And it's also worth asking, how would this fit in with a new history of capitalism? It's a landlocked nation. It has no army, no navy, no empire, little direct involvement in slave trading. It has no coal. It has very little in the way of natural resources at all. In fact, it has no colonies. And yet there it is in the first wave of industrialising nations in 19th century Europe. In all then, I think France and Francophone Europe makes an extremely useful case study, enabling us to unpick those elements of British and maybe US society and economy that were present at the time of industrialisation from those that were actually necessary for industrialisation and the modernisation that went with it to occur. Okay, so it's helpful to begin by defining some terms. I've so far used the term Great Divergence, I've talked about the new history of capitalism, but our original vocabulary for thinking about what happened around the late 18th century was not about capitalism or divergence, it was simply the term the Industrial Revolution. And I think that that's a vocabulary that is worth retaining. Let's start, however, by defining it. At its simplest, I think it can be defined as a revolution in the process and purpose of manufacture. All societies engage in some form of manufacture. It involves taking local resources from the immediate environment and fashioning them, generally by hand, into something useful or necessary or desired. So, for example, forms of housing or forms of clothing, footwear, transport, adornment, all of these things are made and manufactured. And even the most simple society is doing some form of manufacturing. To demonstrate this, I sometimes like to use the example of shoes. So what are we looking at here? We've got on the top left, I'm going to go around clockwise, sandals that have been weaved from coconut leaves from the Pacific island of Guam. Leather moccasins from North America, obviously fashioned out of animal skins. I've got a hemp shoe there that has been made from hemp grown in ancient China. We've got clogs, very common all across Europe. These are French clogs made of Europe. And what all of these so far have in common is they're all made of one product. And of course, that product was very easily available to hand. It was literally there in the local environment. We've also got this woman's shoe from the middle of the 17th century that comes from Britain. It's made of leather. It's still arguably, it's still an organic material in the same way as the others are. And I would imagine that most of the leather would have been sourced quite locally to where the shoe was made. But even then, I think it's important, it's interesting to note there's quite a different form of manufacture that we've got going on here. We've got a soft leather on the top, we've got a different kind of hard leather on the bottom, we've got the two things stitched together by yet another product, another form of animal gut. And though it hasn't survived, this shoe had some kind of gathering, some kind of fastening. So that might have been a buckle that would have been made out of metal, or it could have been perhaps a ribbon, so made out of some form of textile. Clearly, even before we have industrial revolutions, we can have slightly more complicated forms of manufacture. We don't, of course, tend to associate the Industrial Revolution with shoes. But I'm sure if anybody wants to look down at their own shoe, you'll realise that somehow the production of footwear has become industrialised over the years. We know perfectly well when we buy a pair of shoes, whatever shop we buy it in, it was not made by materials that were available in the local environment. And we go further than that. We know it was made in a factory, and a factory is probably thousands of miles away. And we also know that that factory also wasn't using resources from the local environment. They were using some products that have probably travelled many, many, many hundreds of miles before it gets to the factory. In fact, all our textbook accounts of British industrialisation don't look at shoes, but they do look primarily, or a big part of our story is around textiles, which is another form of manufacture, basically. They tend to focus on cotton, machinery, factories, iron, steam engines. A lot of this is implied in the image that we've got here. But I suppose I wanted to emphasise the broad base of the nature of change. And we get a little glimpse of that by looking at these. So what we see here is the really well-known part of the Industrial Revolution, the spinning machines, the factory. But it's worth seeing, these are images number 5 and number 6. And before those, before the kind of the cotton is being spun in the way that we see in these images, there's some earlier images in the series, the progress of cotton, number 1 and of number 2. And what we can see here very clearly is this cotton, unlike traditional forms of manufacture, which are basically societies fashioning what's available locally, this material that's being used in the factories has come from a very distant part of the globe. It's going to have travelled thousands of miles. And what's happening in that factory is those workers are using a material that was not familiar and was not local to them. Likewise, I think what we see in this second image is it's obviously shipped a very long distance from a very distant part of the world, and it comes in a kind of a raw, dirty, unprocessed stage. So again, it's not local to Britain, it's being shipped a long distance in a raw, unprocessed state. And so I think this is another way of thinking about what's going on with the Industrial Revolution. One way of thinking about industrialisation is it's the intensification of manufacture in several respects. The move away from local resources and simple processing for local markets to a reliance on distant resources, complex manufacture for goods that will also be sold on distant markets. The claim, obviously, then, isn't that there is no manufacture or there's no complex manufacture even before Britain. If we think back to Abu Lugod's map, the East then was the centre of the world economy, and it was there because it was very strong at manufacturing. The Chinese had been very good at taking local materials and transforming them into products that people wanted. fine woven cloth mostly, and porcelain plates. When Britain becomes the global leader in the 19th century, they too are very good at making things, but they aren't taking local material from local British shores and manufacturing and exporting it. There is this really vital pre-step of importing the raw material first of all. And that's why we need to think about the British Industrial Revolution, I would say, in a global sense. You can't start this story until you understand what happens in Britain, that what happens in Britain involves sourcing material from other parts of the world. And that's a large part of what I want to do tonight, to think about how it was that Britain had access to the material that it is processing. Now, of course, the movement of goods and people around the globe, again, is not a feature of modernity. Shipping and international trade are very old and they predate the Industrial Revolution by many, many centuries. The Europeans have become involved in the global trade because they want to enjoy goods that they couldn't, for the most part, produce themselves. And since the 15th century, they're very interested in getting involved in global trade. The Portuguese discovered the sea route to India around the Cape of Good Hope in 1498. And in the same decade, the Spanish sailed west across the Atlantic to find their own sea route to Asia. Christopher Columbus discovered the Americas instead. And there, in the Americas, they discover valuable material resources, primarily silver and gold. And of course, over in the east, they gain control of the trade in luxury items, the tea, the spices, the cotton fabrics, the silks, the porcelains, these items that have been coveted in Europe for many, many, many years and delivered to markets, usually overland, of course, by Arab, Venetian and Turkish traders. By the early 16th century, two more European nations have joined the battle for control of the lucrative trade routes, Britain and the Netherlands. What I'm going to argue tonight is that Britain, 2 centuries later, is exploiting its place in global trade networks in new ways. But furthermore, even before Britain had really joined this club of traders, global traders, it had a different set of priorities in mind. For the historian of industrialisation, it's very interesting to observe that from a very early date, the English had a particularly beady eye on how to exploit the resources that they found on their travels. Let's start with Richard Hacket and the views that he expressed in his Discourse of Western Planting here. A very long memorandum written for Elizabeth I in support of Walter Raleigh's plan for settlement in what's now called Virginia. Hacket was a writer, he's not a traveller, he's never travelled further than France, so far as we can tell, and he's often described as a promoter, because what he's trying to do is raise funds to pay for these trips overseas. And throughout his text, Hacket emphasises the resources and the possibility of economic gain. Yes, he says there are mines for gold and silver, but also for more workaday items like copper, lead, iron. Fish, for example, could be brought back, and fish oil, fur and hide, timber, he points out, for shipbuilding, for pitch, tar, soap, hemp, for cordage. And it's even more than that. He says if the British were to send their fleets abroad, that would provide employment for the workmen. And unemployed workmen could migrate overseas and find work there instead of being a drain on the state in England. And raw materials could come back the other way, and they could be put to work, men could be put to work in England manufacturing the goods that they send back. In other words, he sees a whole wide range of benefits. He also says that Britain should, or England should plant forts between Florida and Nova Scotia in order to exploit these resources properly. He's very dismissive of what the Spanish have managed to achieve so far. He says that they have planted, but thinly and slenderly. In truth, he says they're very weak, but a hollow drum. All noise, no substance, a donkey wrapped up in a lion's skin. He thinks a much more substantial presence is required. Now, to repeat again, Hacket is making these claims from the armchair. He's trying to solicit funds. He's not providing us with an account of anything, or an eyewitness account of anything else. But very interesting to note that within decades, we have many, many more writers making much the same set of claims. Of course, as this was intended to encourage settlement, there's always this very positive view of the riches that lay in wait. So a series of declarations of the state of the colony of Virginia, for example, averred that the land contains vines, oranges, lemons, aniseed, almonds, rice, salt, sugarcane, dyestuffs, and other luxury goods that are being imported from the east. None of this, of course, is true. It's promotional literature. But the writers also claim, somewhat more truthfully, that there's an abundance of wood, oak, walnut, cedar, ash, fir, and so forth. They describe how the wood could be exploited for British manufacture and how it might also be used to promote the army to build ships. Iron can be turned into any number of useful iron goods. Fish can be eaten, furs can be worn, skins can be processed. In other words, what these writers are saying is that this land provides not just fish and fowl and birds for those to provide a comfortable living for those who happen to migrate there. What they're saying is there are extra commodities, a surplus that could be exploited and sent back to the mother country too. And a lot of this first wave is about material that you can just kind of pluck from the environment. Very quickly, these are more complex suggestions talking about how you could settle there and plant crops, and you could get farming and raising materials. Cotton and hemp are very often mentioned. One anonymous promoter advocated a natural kind of hemp, a species of flag that could be exported to England and turned into cordage and cloth, as well as a silk grass, which promised admirable return and profit. He concludes the land has enough to furnish not simply her own people, but to supply other nations with stuff and linen. The possibility of making wealth from silk cultivation was dangled in front of the reader in many, many of these texts. Samuel Hartlib's letter purporting to explain how silkworms could be raised there closed breezily with a list of 9 commodities, including cotton, by which he says settlers might get gain and wealth with no or small difficulty. And you could literally do a search of these documents for words like get, gain, profit, wealth, return, and things like that. They're just absolutely littered with these terms. So, of course, this is a very complex literature. It's a large and complex literature, and it's doing much more than the themes that I'm pulling out of it here tonight. At the same time, students of British settlement in the early Americas have pointed out there's a very large gap between the rhetoric of these texts and the reality on the ground. As Jonathan Ecott reminds us, creating wealth and strength out of New England was slow and difficult. But for a historian with interest in British industrialisation, there's something else that stands out. Across these texts, English writers are not only formulating a very particular vision of asset stripping activities in distant lands, they are actually providing the reader with guidelines outlining how such asset stripping might actually be achieved. And to point out again, these ideas are being put forward before Britain has even started to explore the Americas at all. So I think the peculiarity of these images emerges with yet more clearly when contrasted with French exploration in the Americas. The French, like the English, had set about exploring America in the 16th century in the hopes of repeating the success of the Spanish, with the discovery of silver and gold in Mexico and Peru. These hopes, of course, were soon disappointed, and for the French too, this gave rise to new motivations and new engenders rather than the abandonment of the project exploration. But whereas the English turned their attention from gold to the more mundane resources that they did find and the new ways in which they might be monetised, the French imagination wandered on to a rather different set of concerns. I'll begin here with Samuel de Champlain. He's a French explorer. He actually was an explorer. He went to America several times, we think about 20 times. We don't have any images of him, but this is a statue that somebody in, I think there's a bit of creative imagining of what the man might have looked at. It's a statue in Canada. He is, of course, no more representative of the French than Hacket is of English thought, but he was, in the same way, very influential about his nation's overseas expeditions. He made around 24 trips in the early 17th century, producing maps and chronicles of what he found there. And his narratives provide detailed descriptions both of the peoples of the new lands and of its various flora and fauna. He was certainly very interested in the natural environment he encountered and in the resources that it contained. But this was primarily because he's trying to establish what could be consumed by those who were going to try and settle there. So, for example, like the British, he encountered some magnificent woodlands on his expeditions. But when he surveyed the trees of North America, he thought not of the timber, the masts, the planks, the ships, the pitch and the tar of his British equivalents. Instead, he inquired what fruit and nuts it bore, whether they could be eaten, and what effect they might have on the bowels. His interest lay in how the life of French travellers could be sustained in the new alien environment, rather than in what could be extracted, exported, and manufactured from it. As French exploration and settlement developed in the 17th century, the associated literature branched along two distinct lines, missions and botany, though there was in fact really considerable overlap in personnel and style between the two. Certainly much of the energy and the funding for French exploration in the Americas came from the Catholic Church, and their missionaries were primarily interested in making contact with the indigenous inhabitants. A lot of emphasis on language learning, and like de Shampan, they tended to be concerned about the physical environment insofar as this would be the settlers' source of food and shelter, so they needed to understand how they were going to survive there. On the rare occasions where they did address material resources, they tended to do so in a way that, contrasting with the British writers, looks partial and incomplete. For example, Jean-Baptiste Labat was a Jesuit missionary and settler of Martinique. His Nouveau Voyage aux Îles de l'Amérique was mostly devoted to describing the soil, the trees, the plants, and the fruits of the islands. However, in the sixth and final volume, he promised that he would discuss trade and manufactures were established there and the means of making them grow. But he never really delivers on this promise. Most of this section, which is very short, was an extended discussion of cocoa preparation, to which a few notes on vanilla and cashew nuts were added. Like so many French writers, so far as he wrote about colonial resources, and he didn't write about them very much, his interest veered towards culinary curiosity rather than the potential for resource extraction and manufacture. Alongside this large literature sits a body of what we might also call botanical works, a development that has been long recognised and has received a lot of attention within French intellectual history. But let's pause for a moment to consider this with the priorities of the English settlers and travellers. So botanists took an interest in foreign plants, mammals, birds and fish, primarily as objects of study in their own right, rather than as resources to be exported and exploited. As their activities and expeditions were funded and supported by the king, these students of botany dutifully returned to France laden with novel plants and curiosities to give to the king as a gift and could demonstrate his magnificence. Although works of botany sometimes discussed basically a similar set of natural resources as British texts, they inevitably did so with a very different slant. For the most part, they're just silent on the themes of manufacture and industry. Such topics tended to be discussed in the conditional tense, so writers observed that the exploitation of one plant or another might be possible, at the same time indicating that those possibilities were not at present being explored by anybody. For example, the Jesuit traveller Jean-Baptiste du Tertre remarked that the inhabitants of the French West Indies were studying how to cultivate the cocoa plant and considered that if they could master cocoa cultivation, they might make a considerable profit from it. Like so many French travellers in the Americas, du Tertre is alive to the possibility of exploiting natural resources, yet at the same time, he's consistently implying the French settlers hadn't proceeded very far as yet with the work of extraction and commodification. Okay, so I painted a rather simple and speedy comparison between British and French exploration. I want to hedge and qualify what it is I've been saying in a number of ways. The risk is it sounds like I'm saying the French are a little bit esoteric, a little bit airy-fairy in their approach, and I actually don't think that is the case. It's not the right lens to look at it. Firstly, the French are focusing on making contact with indigenous populations because there are very few French settlers in the Americas. The population of British North America stood at 2 million by the 1760s. The French-Canadian population, by contrast, was a mere 70,000 in that decade. That's 3% of the number of British settlers in the Americas. And so what they're effectively trying to do is hold on to this massive territory without any real people or infrastructure to maintain that control. And of course, they do ultimately fail. At the start of the century, New France had been a vast territory spanning from Newfoundland in the north down to the Gulf of Mexico, here we go, in the south. In 1714, much of France's north, the red is what's gone to Britain. In 1714, much of France's northern territory seceded to Britain, and the rest are ceded to Britain and Spain with the conclusion of the 7 Years' War in 1763. And they're obviously subsequently absorbed into Canada and the United States. But these attempts to make contact with the indigenous peoples, to learn their languages and to convert their souls, can, I think, be seen as an alternative form of coercion and control. In the end, it's one that didn't work particularly well, but I don't think it was one that was inspired by greater benevolence. Secondly, as scholars of early modern botany have indicated, the act of naming and classifying and identifying and collecting natural resources in distant parts of distant places are not neutral acts. They may legitimately be understood as the exercise of imperial power. Furthermore, the line between what might be pure botany and economic exploitation is in reality rather fine. In the pre-modern world, as we see with the shoes, for example, natural resources form the basis of almost all manufacture. So exotic plants, shells and wildlife could be offered up as a gift to the king, but equally, they might be exploited for medicinal, culinary or other manufacturing purposes. Foreign curiosities could, in other words, be processed into luxury goods and monetised. They could be exploited to get gain and wealth, to take Samuel Hartlib's formulation, in much the same way as the British are clearly seeking to do with the more mundane items that they deal with, the hemp, the flax, the new species of flag, and so forth. Thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, for the French, as we saw for Britain, there's a really significant gap between the written word on the one hand and the reality on the other. French writers don't spend a lot of time writing about asset stripping and money making, but they do it. France, like its British neighbour, had its monopoly holding merchant companies with traditional mercantile goals trading in furs and fish and other commodities. Jean-Baptiste Labat, whose six-volume work I mentioned a moment ago, may have had almost nothing to say about the Caribbean economy beyond some references to cocoa, vanilla and cashew nut. But he was, in fact, an engineer in Martinique. He'd been appointed by the French government. He was the owner of a sugar estate and, in fact, the owner of several slaves. In other words, he clearly knew a lot more about economic exploitation than he cared to write about. The French could also be effective at settling and colonising. We see this particularly in Saint-Domingue, the French colony that is present-day Haiti. Alone amongst the French colonies, Saint-Domingue managed to escape the fate of the so-called failed development. By the 18th century, it had become the largest and most successful of Europe's sugar colonies and was regarded very much as the jewel in the crown of the French Empire, though one that, of course, was lost through a series of rebellions in the 1790s. Notwithstanding, the mid-18th century was certainly a period of great and sustained growth in the West Indies, the French West Indies. In other words, we can certainly see traces of the British pattern in France. Merchants growing rich on the back of slave trading, plantation, slave-grown sugar, and other exploitative practices. But still, even with the hedging, I do think a significant difference remains. After all, Saint-Domingue really was an outlier in the French experience. By the later 18th century, this is no more than the French commentators themselves would have said. The loss of French possessions, of course, received a lot of commentary. To take one example, let's look at Nicolas Louis Bourgeois. He's described in a French biographical dictionary as a poet, historian and writer, and a very active member of the Académie des Belles-Lettres, Sciences et Arts at La Rochelle. Well, he certainly was these things, but he also spent 25 years in Saint-Domingue promoting the interests of the planters. Yet another example, I think, of the slippage between how French writers tend to self-identify and how they might appear to us. At any rate, Bourgeois provides us with an account of the state of Louisiana and Mississippi as it had been under French possession, admitting, and it's a theme that we see in lots of different texts, they'd never been effectively exploited, and drawing attention to the contrast with the British colonies. Boston, however, which he also visits, he's very taken with. He describes it as a large, populous town with beautiful houses, magnificent public buildings, several churches, skilled workers, cafes, weekly newspapers printing there, where things are done as in London. In Boston, he says, you could believe yourself to be in a good European town. It even had a police force as good as anything you would find in Geneva. Now, of course, we know that strong settlement did not in the end mean that Britain could hold on to its North American colonies either, because in fact, a very large, confident and wealthy community, such as we see here described in Boston, one that resembled those of Europe's, posed problems of a different kind. But that is tangential to my concerns, which are not about how do you hold on to your empire, but rather how do you feed an industrial revolution. And here I think the evidence is fairly clear. No matter how we try and hedge or qualify the evidence concerning British and French activities overseas, it seems to me that we are left with patterns that do look slightly different. As far back as the 16th century, the British had displayed an extraordinary determination to extract resources from the American continent and put them to use in British industry. This had required a substantial migration to put in place the people and the infrastructure necessary to cultivate and export these commodities back to Britain. And the French evidence really underscores the singularity of that particular course of action. Okay, I've got a few more points to make, and then I'm going to bring this all together into some form of conclusion. I've been considering the different ways in which writers with an interest in travel and exploration evaluated the resources of the lands they encountered. But these were not the only writers with an interest in natural resources, or, as they are commonly called in both languages, first materials. In both Britain and in France, there's also a distinct and large body of writing that we can loosely describe as political economy, in which elites and officials address the means of economic improvement. Of course, they do so in ways that are never simple and monolithic. But the traditional view in both countries has been that domestic agriculture is the bedrock of national wealth. Agriculture will provide not only the food for your people, but it will also provide the material, the flax, the wool, the animal hide, the grapes, whatever it might be, that you are then going to turn into saleable goods. In the words of Richard Cantillon, a kind of Irish-French economist, the earth is the source or the material from which all wealth derives. Now, by the time we move into 18th century Britain, there's quite a lot of over-qualification emerging around this view that agriculture and the soil is the source of all wealth. For example, Malachi Postlethwaite, in his well-known 2-volume Universal Dictionary of Trade and Commerce, published in 1757, proposed that Britain should encourage her American colonies to produce first materials for our own domestic manufactures. The state should, he wrote, encourage the American colonies to raise everything for traffic. We mean such materials for British manufactures, including agriculture, husbandry, or planting in every respect. They should do all that is practicable. And it's a complex text. He's saying a lot more and a lot of things about a lot of things, but one theme that comes out very clearly is that the Atlantic colonies should be a source of British manufacturing. We move on a couple of decades to Thomas Mortimer, writing in the 1770s. Of course, he pays lip service to the view that the good manufacturer, ideally works with materials that have been sourced at home, but he confidently adds that it is well known the small extent of the British Isles could never produce a sufficient quantity of raw silk, hemp, flax, iron, naval stores, etc., for her own consumption. And he just takes it for granted that the American colonies are going to be there to make good the distinction. So this is the kind of the Pomerantz idea that you extend your soil by having a colony some other part of the world. Now, by the second half of the 18th century, some French writers are also very definitely coming around to this view. Consider, for example, Jacques Acarias de Sérion, writing in the Journal de Commerce in 1762. Oh no, I haven't got him there. There we go. That's just immediately prior, of course, to the loss of France's remaining North American territories. At the time of writing, that misfortune was, of course, unknown. But de Sérion knew perfectly well that France's exploitation of Louisiana looked nothing like what the British were up to in North America. Louisiana, he thought, might be an inexhaustible well if only France could get on and develop it. He also echoes the views of a much earlier generation of English writers, recommending that the state should fund voyages and exploration precisely so that they can get the resources that they need for domestic manufactures. But of course, this is all a pipe dream in 1762. These essays have scarcely been published. and France is retrenching rather than expanding its empire. De Serien's perspective was not only out of step with the realities of French imperial control, it was also out of step with most French thought about the relationship of overseas territories and the domestic economy. And so you do, in fact, get an awful lot of writing about sheep. As the influential physiocratic thinker François Quesnay put it, the earth, again, echoing the ideas of Cantillon, the earth is the sole source of wealth. And you have many, many books written about sheep. The French can't seem to believe their luck about these animals that you can both eat and wear. And there's an awful lot of effort put into how we're going to kind of develop the domestic sheep farming industry so that you have the materials and the food that you need. So now I really am going to close. I'm going to do so by looking at just one more French writer on the way out. And that is this man, Jean-François de Tolleson, who writes a dissertation or a treatise on the commerce of France and her colonies, published in 1789. So, of course, given the date, there is the now familiar theme that France had once had these wonderful extensive overseas possessions in North America, but they'd never been fully developed, and now, of course, regretfully, they've all been lost. He speaks much more positively of what's going on in the West Indian plantations, but again, there's this sense that there's more scope for additional development, and that tends to be the assessments even when the French are looking at the West Indies. There was always a sense that more could be done, I think very often with an eye to what the British are doing. And of course, we know that the immediate future for the French was the loss of its West Indian colonies of Saint-Domingue, not in fact further development. But actually, what I think is no less interesting than what de Tolleson has to tell us and say about the colonies is the overview of the French economy that he provided. He provides us with some numbers, and he goes through different parts, he breaks the economy down into segments and counts them and measures them all up, and that's what we're looking at here. For the objects of agriculture, he tells us 1,826 million. For those of industry, 524 million pounds, livres, he's using that currency. Products of the colonies, 200,000, which provides us with a breakdown that looks something like this. And as you can see, for Tolleson, 72% is basically the agricultural sector of the economy. So he thinks that agriculture is much more important than your manufacturing because the basis, the two are overlinked. And the colonies are certainly worth developing, but they're just a slice. Now the curiosity, and I would say the significance of these numbers, is that so far as we can tell, de Tolleson hadn't, in 1789, actually done any counting at all. At the back of the book, we have these marvellous tables. And there are tables and pages and pages of these. What he wants us to do is to start counting. He hasn't actually done it yet. And so far as I can see, there's no way he could have had any real numbers. They're very much back of the envelope calculations that he's looking at. So I think what this really tells us, it just brings us back again to the sheep, basically. This is a world view that de Tolleson has. The French do become very good at collecting statistical data about the economy, but they're just not actually doing it at this moment. I think what we really see, though, is this view in France that domestic agriculture is the source of your wealth, and that is the thing that you need to develop in order to grow your economy. And just to say again, de Tolleson is in charge of the Bureau de Commerce. He's trying to grow the economy, and that's how he thinks you're going to do it. So this really does bring me to my conclusion. My question is about the making of the modern world. Why did Britain and other Anglophone and Francophone and other European nations start to industrialise and so gain wealth and power vis-à-vis the rest of the world? So as I'm saying, at heart it's a revolution in forms of manufacture. As your processing becomes more sophisticated, your technology becomes more sophisticated, you need more raw material to shove into your machine. So you're in this kind of ever ratcheting up process. And these are the things that we need to explain. In the case of Britain, I've been thinking here about the raw materials part of the problem. Technology has been very well covered. A lot has been written about British technology, but I've been throwing in the idea that you need to think about the material that technology uses as well. And here, I really want to stress the deep roots of change and to dismiss the significance of luck or contingency. It was no accident that Britain, at the end of the 18th century, ended up with the capacity to exploit resources in different parts of the globe, the distant parts of the globe. sometimes in the context of colonies and sometimes within the context of asymmetrical trading relationships. And of course, there's a whole lot more to say that I haven't talked about tonight about the relationships with the East rather than to the West. It was the outcome of a pattern of behaviour and thought that spans at least 2 centuries. Britain didn't industrialise because by some stroke of good fortune it was the lucky possessor of some textile fibre producing colonies. The other way round. It possessed these colonies and was able to extract the resources it wanted from them precisely because it had been prowling the globe in the single-minded pursuit of such resources. At the same time, though, and turning to France, how much weight do we want to give to the British-American experience in our writing about global history and change? There's no one raw material that you need to have in order to have an industrial revolution, and there's no one way to get it. There are many, many different routes. French producers understood this perfectly well. They understood that manufacturers needed raw materials. They were just looking in a different place in order to provide it. Now, of course, as French industrialisation followed that of Britain by several decades, we might infer that their approach was not optimal. But follow it most certainly did. So we might also infer that whilst the French approach was not ideal, it was not doomed either. Though I haven't had the space to develop it fully here, I think evidence from Belgium, Switzerland, and later Holland, Germany, and Scandinavia shows us that there are a whole host of different materials you could use for industrialisation, and a very wide range of different ways you can get your hands on whatever material it is that you need. In other words, I don't want to downplay the role of war, capitalism, slavery, violence, and empire and coercion in the case of the development of Britain and North America. I do, however, want to suggest that a truly global history involves moving beyond the Anglo-American experience. Thank you.